Hello! In this video, I'd like to talk about the paper Social Psychological Interventions in Education. They're Not Magic by Yeager and Walton. This paper addresses a very exciting and, to some, puzzling trend in the education literature. A wide variety of papers show short, non-academic interventions targeting students' feelings and beliefs about school that produce statistically significant improvement in academic achievement that lasts for several years. This is quite shocking, but Yeager and Walton explain the psychological theory behind these results and give us hope that we can scale them, but only with proper understanding of how they work. One point of skepticism is that traditional academic interventions that provide students with increased educational resources tend to be much less effective than these social psychological ones. Here, two factors influence students' use of educational resources. First, how much educational resources are available, and second, what sorts of psychological forces are encouraging or discouraging students to make use of them. In the case that students don't have a lot of psychological barriers to learning, students are highly motivated to learn and aren't distracted by anxieties, but there aren't enough learning resources, interventions that increase learning opportunities should have a big effect on student learning. However, if students aren't motivated to learn, or if there are psychological barriers that distract them from learning, adding more educational resources to the pile students already aren't making use of won't make much of a difference. And these forces are mostly invisible to us educators. If students aren't motivated to learn or are distracted from their learning, we usually don't get to see why. A big part of the magic behind these interventions are positive feedback loops. And I use that term in the mathematical sense. A positive feedback loop reinforces the current state whether we want it or not. Students who experience academic success build confidence and investment in their classes and gain access to more educational resources. But students who experience academic setbacks can become demotivated and distracted by stress and anxiety. Our goal is to get students off this downward positive feedback loop and onto this upward positive feedback loop, but also to adjust the forces in this feedback loop to make it easier for students to stay on an upward trajectory. A key theme in these interventions is targeting students' attributions, particularly for academic setbacks. Why do students believe they are experiencing these setbacks? Depending on their answer, their response will vary widely. Students often encounter academic setbacks as part of their transition to a new learning environment. This runs the risk of students attributing these setbacks to a lack of ability on their part. This is specifically a belief that academic setbacks are inevitable and will be persistent. To a student with these beliefs, it makes sense to save the effort of trying in their classes. Again, these students believe that academic setbacks are inevitable, regardless of the effort they put into their classes, and also to drop out. In 1982, Wilson and Linville devised an intervention to help students understand that transition-based academic setbacks early in college were natural and would dissipate. That was as simple as having students listen to interviews with upperclassmen describing initial academic setbacks and attributing them to causes that went away. This simple intervention boosted GPAs and led to students being 80% less likely to drop out, and has been successfully repeated many times. Students don't magically understand how learning works or what school is all about. It's common to see students with a belief in intelligence, an unchanging attribute that they either have or do not have that predicts their academic success. Again, students who see themselves as doomed to failure won't put effort into their classes and are likely to drop out. This is the fixed mindset. What we would really like is for students to understand that through effort, they can improve their academic performance. This is the growth mindset. Both of these mindsets are self-reinforcing. Students with a fixed mindset won't put any effort into their classes and so won't see any academic growth. And that is consistent with their idea that their level of academic performance is fixed, and so that will reinforce their mindset. On the other hand, students with a growth mindset who experience academic setbacks will put more effort into their courses. They'll see that increase in effort leading to academic success, and that is consistent with the growth mindset. And so it will reinforce the growth mindset within them, in addition to getting them on the success effort feedback loop. These mindsets exist on a continuum, and even small changes in our choice of language can affect where students fall in the moment. The go-to experiment for the growth mindset is by Mueller and Dweck from 1998. Fifth grade students were given moderately difficult logic problems, then praised on their performance. The praise varied from neutral, you got a high score, to fixed mindset, you must be very smart at these problems, to growth mindset. You must have worked hard. These later two types of praise temporarily pushed students towards either the fixed or growth mindsets. Then the experimenters simulated an academic setback. They gave students a set of nearly impossible logic problems. Finally, they provided students with logic problems comparable to the first and compared scores. Students who got growth mindset praise saw the difficult problems as a challenge that could be overcome with effort. They saw that and they wanted that, and so put more effort into the last set of logic problems and asked for more difficult logic problems in the future. Students who got the fixed mindset praise saw their poor performance on the difficult problems as a real blow to their self-confidence. Distracted by the setback, they did worse on the last set of logic problems and only wanted easy logic problems in the future to help build up their confidence again. In 2007, Blackwell, Chesnevsky, and Dweck devised an intervention for middle school students that just told them about the brain's ability to form new connections when working on challenging tasks as part of a series of study skills workshops. This intervention reversed the usual downward trend in math grades and has had many successful replications. Another major element in the web of students' feelings and beliefs about education is negative academic stereotypes. Negative academic stereotypes about a group a student belongs to can lead them to see academic setbacks as inevitable and distract them with stress and anxiety. There's this great study that's not covered in Yeager and Walton by Spencer, Steele, and Quinn from 1999 that looked at mathematically talented undergraduates. They provided them with a test and told one group that it previously showed gender differences in performance. With negative academic stereotypes fresh in their mind and distracted by anxiety about conforming to those stereotypes, the female undergraduates performed worse. Another group of students were assured that the test had previously not showed any gender difference in performance. In this case, the female undergraduates didn't have the distraction of negative academic stereotypes to worry about, and they did equally well to the male undergraduates. This is a great result, but like all of these results, we need to be careful taking away any concrete interventions from it. Bringing up negative academic stereotypes, if only to debunk them, might accidentally just make those stereotypes more salient in students' minds. So what can we do about stereotype threat? Self-affirmation theory suggests that when students are focusing on diverse positive aspects of themselves, it can reduce their stress. If I understand correctly, we're trying to give students positive thoughts about themselves to overpower the negative thoughts coming from negative stereotypes. Cohen et al. Showed that having 7th graders participate in a 20-minute writing exercise about values that they find are personally important significantly improved Black students' grades and reduced the achievement gap between Black and white students by 40%. This is a common intervention to address stereotype threat that has been successfully replicated many times, including for women in science and Latino adolescents. Students who feel like they belong in academia are on a positive feedback loop of confidence and success that also includes feeling more confident to reach out for support, for instance by attending office hours, attending tutoring, or reaching out to other students for help. But students who are subject to negative academic stereotypes are especially vulnerable to not feeling like they belong, which can put them on the downward side of this positive feedback loop. developing stress and anxiety that distracts them from performing at their best, leading to academic setbacks which can further their feelings of not belonging. Walton and Cohen devised an hour-long intervention that let students know that feelings of non-belonging were a natural part of the transition to college, and had freshmen write essays to incoming students about how their feelings of belonging changed. Note that the incoming students were not part of this study. Sneakily, it was the freshmen who were writing the essays that were being studied. This intervention was incredibly successful. It improved Black students' grades through senior year and halved the achievement gap between Black and white students. Student surveys showed that Black students who received the intervention no longer questioned whether they belonged in college when facing adversity, improving their reported health and happiness. This sort of intervention has had many successful replications, including for African American middle school students and female undergraduates in engineering. A big takeaway from all of these studies is that we need, as Yeager and Walton describe it, a precise understanding of students' subjective experience in school, both to identify psychological barriers to learning and to anticipate how students will respond to particular interventions. For instance, these interventions sneakily avoided the appearance of interventions, taking the form of surveys, class assignments, or mentoring younger students. Direct interventions risk students becoming defensive or feeling stigmatized, in which case they won't be as effective or might even be counterproductive. Much of the success, particularly the long-term success of these interventions, comes from the already existing positive feedback loops in school. As educators, when we see some of our students repeatedly having academic success and some of our students repeatedly having academic failure, it's important to remember that this isn't an inherent trait of them, but rather an indication of where they fall in these feedback loops, something we can change with interventions that adjust the forces of these feedback loops. A key part of working with positive feedback loops is making changes early. The more time students can spend on the upward side of the positive feedback loop, the better. There are natural reset points in students' academic careers, the beginning of middle school or high school or college, and most of the interventions Yeager and Walton look at were timed around these. At the beginning of a new school, messages from these feedback loops are weaker. Students who felt they were bad at high school might be open to the possibility that college might be different. And so messages from these interventions can be relatively stronger than the already existing messages from these feedback loops, and so are more likely to have a bigger impact. Yeager and Walton caution us against trying to thoughtlessly reproduce these interventions. What makes them work is the psychological experience for students, not the specific activity students wind up doing. They describe an experiment where students were doing essentially the same activity, writing about why schoolwork is important, but with vastly different psychological experiences. When students were asked to come up with ideas about why schoolwork is important for themselves, they saw an improvement in GPA. But when students were told why schoolwork was important and told to write about that, it was counterproductive. In terms of work that got done, these are almost identical, but in terms of the psychological experience, they're very different. Let's take a moment to think about how a student who is struggling academically might experience these activities. If this student has to come up with reasons why schoolwork is important, they're going to have to really wrestle with their ideas about schoolwork and figure out why they're being made to do work in school at all. They might even come up with the idea of the growth mindset on their own. On the other hand, if a student is struggling academically and they're told why schoolwork is important, they're going to become very defensive and the message really isn't going to sink in. They might even feel like this is emphasizing their academic struggles. Figuring out how students are likely to perceive a social psychological intervention requires both an understanding of psychology and familiarity with the specific classroom's culture. We just saw an example of getting the psychology wrong when trying to replicate an intervention. The paper gives an example of getting the culture wrong. Suppose we're trying to combat stereotype threat by having our students identify values that are personally important to them. We're of course going to want to give them some example values to get them started, and if the examples we give are very out of touch, students are going to be much less invested in the assignment. So Yeager and Walton propose having psychological engineers, experts who work with local educators to adapt interventions to specific classrooms while keeping their psychological effects. The local educators who are in touch with their classroom's culture can make sure that the interventions are relevant to their students, and the psychological engineers can make sure that any changes that had to be made don't ruin the psychological effect of the intervention. So what can we take away from this paper? First, Yeager and Walton warn us about trying to implement these interventions on our own without psychological experts to help us. As the title of the paper says, these interventions aren't magic. They don't just magically work. We need to make sure to get the psychological effect correct, and the best way to do that is by consulting psychological experts. Second, it's important to imagine what our classes are like from the perspective of our students, particularly our students who feel like they're struggling academically. And this is true generally. Understanding how our students perceive our lessons is essential to making sure they'll be effective. But particularly, try to understand what might be distracting students in lecture and during assessments, and think about ways you can restructure your classes to give these students a fair chance. Third, the strength of these interventions suggests that our students who are struggling academically are doing so not because of lack of eventual ability, not because of something inherent to them, but because of their position in a positive feedback loop. This is the growth mindset, and not only do we want our students to develop this mindset, but we need to develop this mindset as well. Not only so that we can be effective educators to our students who are struggling academically, but also because our mindset leaks out and influences our students in everything from our casual language choices to how we structure our classes. And finally, it's important that we work to cultivate a feeling of belonging in our classrooms. Students who feel like they belong are much more likely to reach out for academic resources like office hours and will be less distracted by anxiety and less likely to drop out. Psychological and cultural experts can help advise you on how to do that. So thanks for watching. I highly recommend you give the full article a skim. Meanwhile, let me know if you have any questions or comments below, and I hope to see you in a future video.